Who should the Jazz draft if in the top 4 of the NBA draft or at 8? And are there any first-round gems? Find out next on Locked On Jazz.
You are Locked On Jazz, your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Jazz. I'm Leif Thulin. You guys know me now, but I'm excited to be back with you. As always, honored to have the opportunity to fill in for David Locke on Locked On Jazz. I'm a lifelong Jazz fan who is a credentialed NBA draft analyst for Locked On NBA Big Board, attendee of the 2023 NBA Combine, soon to be the 2024 NBA Combine, Jazz broadcast assistant, statistician, and lover of basketball at all levels. So I'll give you a different perspective than the typical one, with a lot of knowledge about the college game and how they'll translate to the NBA. And I do love stats, maybe not as much as your mainstay, David Locke, and his geeky numbers, but I'll give you a fair few. So thank you for making Locked On Jazz your first listen. And remember, Locked On Jazz is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube at Locked On Jazz, where the best way to help us grow is to comment anything below. And today's question is an easy one. If the Jazz were to select at 1, who would you take? Today's show is brought to you by Monopoly Go, so thank you to them. And also thank you to this guy, Richard Stayman, a.k.a. MavsDraft, who will give you an expert yet differing perspective on the NBA draft. We talk off air quite frequently about the NBA draft, and we typically have similar thought processes, but evaluations are different, and that's part of evaluation in itself. So thank you for joining us, Richard.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Always a pleasure to talk the draft with you, and I'm happy to have a segment to do it with you here. In the first segment, we've got an interesting situation here. The Jazz, what we're going to discuss, we will discuss if the Jazz should draft at 1 through 4. Who should they take? And this is a year where it's not obvious who's going to go 1. It's not obvious who's going to go 2. It's not obvious who's going to go 3 or 4. So we're going to talk about the possibilities of the Jazz drafting 1 through 4 in the first segment. The second segment, we'll discuss the favorite prospects for the Jazz at 8, 9, or 10, which are the only possibilities, 1 through 4, and 8, 9, and 10. 5, 6, 7 are not possible for the Jazz. I'll go over that as well. And in the final segment, we'll talk about some late round steals we think the Jazz could pursue at 29, and we'll touch about 32 as well, because the Jazz have a very early second rounder. So let's dive right in. As I was alluding to just moments ago, the Jazz have the 8th best odds to get number 1. That doesn't mean they're assured to get the 8th pick. It is the most likely by percentage by about 3%. But the Jazz, if they move up, don't only move up to 7 or 6 or 5. That's actually impossible for the Jazz. If the Jazz were to move up from 8, they find themselves in the top 4. There's a 26% chance of that happening. And that's, if you want to break it down, it's about 6%, 6%, 7%, and about 7% for the Jazz. And so it would be pretty great if the Jazz could do that. And it's possible. That's over a quarter chance. There's also a 35% chance the Jazz get 8, a 32% the Jazz get 9, and a 6.7% the Jazz get 10, and only a 0.4% the Jazz fall out of the top 10, which would concede to the Oklahoma City Thunder. So, Richard, I'll ask you the question I asked the YouTube channel. Then we'll talk about the more likely situations. If the Jazz had number 1, who would you take?
You know, it's hard to say taking a big here, but at the same time, it's in terms of true bigs that defensively, like the Walker Kesslers type, you only have 1 in Utah. So I actually wouldn't be opposed to Alex Sarr, and I think he could complement both Walker Kessler and Lauri Markkanen. I think he can fit in there. Obviously, front court is very crowded right now, but I do think there is value to having him there, and I think he's somebody that he's the best player on the board. Like, you just make him work.
I like that in the sense of best player available. That's my philosophy. We've talked about this a lot. I'm not sold on the superstar potential that you necessarily typically have at 1. Like, often the word generational is overused, and last year there was a generational talent with Victor Wembanyama, but most years there's a somewhere in between in which you have a guy that you think is going to be a star. I don't know what I see from Sarr in terms of the upside, outside of being just incredibly productive. I think, for those of you who don't know, Alex Sarr he's playing in Perth, Australia. He had a showcase against the G League where he really burst onto the scene from being maybe a top 10 guy to maybe the guy at number 1. And I think he's the safest pick here. I haven't convinced myself that he's my absolute do or die number 1, but right now, the way I see it, he's also my number 1. So let's get back to the main conversation. The Jazz have a 26% chance of being in the top 4. And the first thing I want to ask you is, how different is 4 from 8 this year? Because in a lot of years, you kind of have a predetermined order, at least for a couple of the picks, and then it becomes interesting in that in between. This year, I don't think there's that much of a difference. But is it the type of year where, yes, there's not so many stars, so maybe you really want to be at the top because 8 doesn't produce the quality that 1, 2, 3, 4 does? Or is maybe being lower in the draft a better thing in disguise?
I think this is going to be a year where the good scouting teams separate themselves. Number one for me is just I've got Alex R in his own tier. After that, there's a pretty wide range tier, I would say, from like 2 to 8, like, or so. So like if you're really just at that point, it's coming down to preference and models and analytics and things like that. However you order your draft boards as a team, I don't see that much of a difference between 2 and 8 this year. This is a year where the top is just completely jumbled together.
I mostly agree with that. My philosophy is typically like, if you're going to be bad as a team throughout the year, you might as well be as bad as you possibly can be. But although this year there is a little more leeway. So aside from the strategy of a team picking, let's just talk about the best prospects. And I think I'm very best player available typically, but the last episode I did for all you everydayers, you know this, and for Richard, just to catch you up, I talked about the lack of redundancy on teams that are trying to compete. And so you don't want to have overlap, and that's how good teams are built. So there is going to be some sort of fit mattering, but the Jazz don't have the luxury of being picky about that right now. So who are your top prospects that you would consider picking, whether it's at 1 through 4? Obviously, Sarr is your 1. So let's take, other than him, who would you consider at 4 that you don't think necessarily will be there at 8?
Yeah, I think it's God, that's tough because there's a lot of different names. I'm about to ramble on to them, but I think if you want to avoid the redundancy, there's very few players that bring the skill set plus size combination. Even though I'm not as high on this guy as a lot of other people, I do think if you're just trying to avoid redundancy, I think Zachary Risacher has some of the most unique blend of talent and size. He's about 6'10", 3 and D. Not many teams have that. That's extremely valuable. The best 3 and D guys are usually 6'7" to 6'9", give or take an inch. You really don't see him at 6'10", and Risacher is a true 6'10". I think he's somebody that'd be really valuable there. If you're swinging for the fences, you go for like Ron Holland, who's about a 6'6" wing, who I really don't know off the top of my head. I feel like Utah doesn't have someone like him that has that 2-way, 3-level scoring upside, right? So I think those are 2 guys that I would be looking at right away as like, you know, the unique archetypes for Utah.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, Risacher is heralded for his shooting prowess. That said, he's been struggling of late. Many of his comparisons have been to someone of the ilk of Michael Porter Jr., where he's a tall shooter who's got defensive potential because of size, but isn't necessarily a stopper on that end. Holland, I talked about a few days ago. For those of you who heard it, this may be a little bit of a reiteration, but for those of you who haven't, he's a slasher by nature, really competitive, a very good athlete who I think needs to refine some skills, particularly as a shooter and as a scorer, to make himself worthy of that top candidacy. That said, I think I have Holland in that top 4. I noticed he was on Tankathon and Ringer, some popular boards lower. He was at 8 and 12 respectively on those 2. I would put him in that top tier. I also have flirted with the idea of having Cody Williams very high for many points of this year. I'm kind of in and out of that stage right now. And then one other guy that, and we mentioned Sarr, so I don't want to exclude him from this conversation, but another guy that intrigues me, and I haven't talked about yet to all of the Jazz fans listening, is Nikola Topic. So Richard, can you give them just a breakdown of what you see of Topic, and would you consider him here? I haven't talked about him, and I don't think I'd take him this high, but he does to me have a skill set that if he hits would be worth that pick.
Yeah, Topic is a really unique guard. He's kind of like a point forward, not a true point guard, but not a true point forward, if that makes sense. He's still very young, doesn't turn 19 until after the draft. He's extremely comfortable with both hands. You see him finishing just as confidently going left as he is going right, which is his dominant hand. I think he has really good shooting touch, but that jump shot is really far away. He has a flat line drive shot, but you look at the free throws, they go in a lot, and that's generally the biggest indicator in pre-draft processes is how is the free throw percentage. And his is in the high 80s. So it's a very good number. He also just isn't really that explosive. So I think it's going to come down to preference of what you want in the guard. The lack of explosive finishing is really the issue that's holding it back, I think, as being a top guy.
All right, I got one more name for you here. Jazz Nation, especially during the NCAA tournament, were very keen to say, well, the Jazz should go for Stefan Castle. Would you consider Stefan Castle in the top 4? Why or why not?
I haven't gotten to Castle yet as a top guy. I really liked him in the preseason. I think he actually is my preseason number 1. But the shooting is just too wild for me, and I feel like I'm seeing too much Jared Culver, and that's what scares me. Then now I will say, big difference between the two. Castle is much more of a true point guard than Jared Culver is, or was, I should say. And honestly, he might be an even better defender, and Culver was a very good defender. So that's kind of where I'm at, is like, okay, yeah, a pesky point guard who really, he can run the offense, he can defend, but the jump shot's not there. That's kind of like, I feel like that's very similar to what Chris Dunn is, and I'm not trying to like throw comparisons around instead of like the actual scouting, but like, when you look at, we talked about it, the redundancy. If you could have Chris Dunn year over year for cheaper for the next 3 years, he might have more of a defensive impact than Stefan Castle with not a terribly far offensive drop off. Like, I think that jump shot could be a fatal flaw potentially.
Yeah, I talked about Castle on yesterday's Locked On Jazz. My question for him is, did UConn maximize him? So all the good things he did that shined, were those because of UConn, or was that all there the entire season and only was showcased on the brightest stage because he bloomed later and he could have done more? And that's something that, that's going to be asked on a bunch of different players, but especially for him. And the last thing is, yes, it would be a skill set that the Jazz don't really have in their starting lineup because you don't factor Dunn into the starting lineup
Right.
long term. He's 6'6", and what the Jazz are infatuated by, or at least Jazz fans, is the size. Because last time the Jazz had diminutive backcourt, it ended a postseason run short because they were defensively inept, and he's exceptional defensively. So last thing, is there anyone else you would mention worthy of drafting in the top 4 other than the guys we've mentioned?
I think there's one more guy. This one's tough. I think you and I go a little bit back and forth on him, and that is Reed Shepherd. I think if you're looking for somebody who he does, I don't feel like he does a lot. Well, he kind of is similar to some guys, so it is a little bit worrisome. But I think his game is so safe that he adapts to any lineup, and that's Reed Shepherd. I really like his game. Produces a bunch of defensive statistics. Can shoot the cover off. I mean, he shot 52% from 3 this year. That's insane. And it's a very real shot. I think he's a better playmaker than he's given credit for, the old Kentucky thing. I like him. I think I would put him in there just because I think he complements any superstar that a team eventually gets. So I like his game a lot.
I disagree on Shepherd just because I think when you're drafting a player to be a starter, I'm not saying that these guys are all stars right off the bat, and that's just not what you're getting in this draft. I don't think you want to have a guy who's small that isn't a natural point guard. And defensively, I think a lot of that is fool's gold statistically, not because he doesn't have the anticipation, not because he doesn't have the coordination. I just don't think he's big enough. And the Jazz, I think, will look to avoid and try to take someone with either positional size or just some skill that stands out at the highest level. And the only other guy I would consider would be Rob Dillingham, because he can score. And I made the pitch, how many players in this draft class do you think can score 20 points pretty quickly in their careers? And I would say Dillingham is one of very few. So we'll continue that debate in a moment. We have to get to the next segment. So coming up next, the Jazz could easily be drafting in the mid-lottery, 8 through 10. So Richard and I will analyze the players who factor into that equation, including Rob Dillingham. But first, let me tell you about Prize Picks. What is Prize Picks, you may ask? Prize Picks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 3 million members. It's the easiest and most exciting way to get in on the action while watching your favorite players in sports. You can pick more or less than on 2 or more player stats. So you can go 2 through 5, and your winnings depend on how many player stats you pick more or less on. And it's interesting. There's a science to it. You can study. They have projections and all. I've used it for baseball plenty of times. I like to bet on the strikeouts. That's my favorite one, to go over on the strikeouts of pitchers that are prone to striking players out. And it's very fun to watch a game when you've got a little bit of incentive on it. So you should use it on the NBA or MLB, and especially the NBA right now, because you can get in on the playoff action and win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks as you and the world's best players take the game to a new level during basketball's postseason. You can now win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn 10 into 1,000 with basketball, hockey, and baseball entries today on PrizePicks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. You can pick Jokic over 11 rebounds or Durant over on points and make money if they achieve those feats. It makes watching the games even better. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. That's Locked On NBA. And then let me tell you about Murdoch Hyundai. And actually, Murdoch Hyundai is more and more near and dear to my heart right now because I've been driving a Tucson. As you can see right here, I got the keys. So Murdoch Hyundai has been in Utah for over 80 years. Hyundai is the best car for your money. Safety features, bells and whistles, and all the amazing cars and amazing prices. If someone's in the lane to your left, you know about it because the car will give you a little caution sign and a beep. And that it powers over your music. It's really nice, and you have a very safe ride. It's got great pickup in all different modes, hybrid, electric, somewhere in between. They've got it all. The SUV lineup from the Kona to the Tucson to the Palisade. And like I said, I've been riding and driving in the Tucson of late, and I've really loved it. And as I showed you, I got the keys right here and couldn't recommend it more highly. They also have the Ioniq 5, which was named the Motor Trend SUV of the Year by Motor Trend. And then the new Ioniq 6 is even better. It's amazing. It's electric, looks like a Porsche, and just won the World Car of the Year. There are 3 locations, Linden, Murray, and Logan. And I can personally tell you how wonderful the people are in Murray. And last time I went in there, they were like, "Oh my gosh, you're Leif from Locked On." I was like, "How on earth do you know that?" But I appreciated it nonetheless. And I'm sure all the other venues are equally as wonderful, and the people are equally as warm. Welcome back to Locked On Jazz. I'm Leif Thulin, and I'm joined by Richard Stayman. But before we get back into this, let me ask, are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN and on your TV all day and have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All righty, welcome back to Locked On Jazz. Leif Thulin and Richard Stayman here. Richard, the Jazz are in a bit of a basketball purgatory. They've missed the playoffs. They haven't had a commitment to being either really good or really bad in the past few seasons since trading Mitchell and Gobert. Last year, the Jazz drafted 9 and are in a similar spot this year, likely drafting 8. So should the Jazz draft 8, 9, or 10, where do you start? Like, what's the player that stands out to you most?
Yeah, I think at this point, I would go with the best combination of size and skill and just swing for the fences, especially because you have other spots in the draft where you can get those needs filled in and get the ready now players. But you could take someone like Matas Buzelis, for example, or Cody Williams, I think at around the 8 range. I think that would actually be a very helpful spot for them.
Yeah, that's where the first episode I did, I talked about Buzelis, Holland, and Williams. And I said all 3 of the wings I could see being picked in the top 4. Should the Jazz be drafting there? If one team really likes them, and I gave the reasons as for why I personally like them, those guys will all be higher on my board than 8, I believe. And I initially was low on Buzelis. I was quite high on Holland, and I've been among the highest on Cody Williams. So I like the positional size. I like the skill level from all 3, especially but Cody Williams and Buzelis. Buzelis, I've mentioned, I don't know if he's got that dogged competitor, that fierce ability to score, but I think there was improvements, and Holland just needs to improve his shot because he's got those athletic traits that I think can translate into being a two-way, really good basketball player. Quickly, I want to get back to the conversation about Dillingham. Dillingham, I think, is the only small, diminutive guard that I would consider taking in the top 5, or in the Jazz's case, top 4, because he's got that ability to score. I made the comparison of, look, I don't think he's Trae Young, but in a similar vein to what Trae Young does, he could be your offense and quickly be a pick and roll guy who dominates because he can score. He can do it by himself. He can come off picks. He can swing the ball on live dribbles. He can throw lobs. He can find pocket passes. And then he scores 20 and gets you 7 assists right there. And I don't know how many players in this draft have the capacity to do that. They may be better two-way players, but that's a valuable thing in and of its own. And I know Trae Young is often ridiculed right now. And like I said, he's not Trae Young, but that's something that's so rare that I would take a chance on it. But the rest of the players, I really think I would choose these 3 players over just about all the other guys in this draft that you mentioned between Buzelis, Holland, and Cody Williams.
So I agree with what you're saying. I actually don't like the fit for Utah, to be honest. Like, you just drafted Keontae George last year, who's going to be playing an extremely similar role. not going to say Colin Sexton's going to be the reason you don't draft him, but you also have Colin Sexton, who you can move. I get it. But I just feel like there's too much redundancy at the minimum with Keontae, and you're already putting yourself in a weird pickle. I'm kind of against it on paper. I get it, though. Like, if another team, like if Dillingham is the guy, if he ends up being great, maybe you're still at this point of the quote unquote, like the retooling, where if Dillingham shows even more this year than Keontae showed this last year, yeah, maybe you can move Keontae then. But so you can kind of calculate that risk, but I feel like that could also blow up in your face very quickly.
I agree with that. I think from a skill set level and based on my evaluation of the players, he's the only guy I would take. For the Jazz, I don't like the fit. I've long told Jazz fans I'm a best player available fan, but I do think the best player available has to factor in how you first see them playing for your team. It's not necessarily who else is there, because if you think that good, they're that good, you can still pick them. But I don't know. Danny Ainge said in his press conference that I've referred to many times the last few days on Locked On Jazz that we aren't committed to Keontae George as the franchise point guard, but we think he can play the point guard and the shooting guard. And so that's not like the negative that you may think, oh, we don't have our franchise point guard. How often do you get a franchise point guard at 16 in the draft? The fact that it's contemplated is really good. So I think there's a chance it's Dillingham. But I'll focus this on the wings. I really think that Cody Williams, Buzelis, and Holland are the three targets for the Jazz that I'm most interested in. And I would throw in Castle as well, but I have a little bit of hesitation with Castle just because I think he was either so well maximized by UConn that there's not enough, or the question is, how much can he score? Because if you're drafting him even higher at the top 4, like some Jazz fans want for Castle, or Kevin O'Connor's got him ranked number 1, how much faith do you have in that guy to score? Or is all the faith in a guard defensively? And like that just is so rare. And the last guy that I think had more faith defensively than offensively was Anthony Black, but I thought Anthony Black was better in pick and roll than what Castle was allowed to show. And Black, for what it's worth, is not behind a redundant group of guards that are a little bit older and they're on a good winning team, but he wasn't able to contribute that much, and he was the 6th pick. So that's my hesitancy. I think the Jazz should go for a wing, but not out of need. I just think it's the best positional group in the draft.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I really think unless you're getting a franchise-changing guard, the only one I think I would even consider truly drafting, like the Reed Shepherd, I know I said earlier, but I feel like he complements everything, and we obviously disagree with that. The only guard I think I would take at the top, though, is really, I think it's Topic. Like he can be that lead guard with size. He's got the standout skills. I think he's the best candidate to be that high upside hit for Utah.
I agree. I had a conversation with a friend who's a listener of Locked On Jazz, and this is well before I knew I was taking over for this iteration, and only as the season started and Topic was kind of becoming more and more of a popular name. I said, if Topic's skills hit, I think he's got the most upside of this draft class. I think he's got the most likelihood to be a star of anyone in this class if his skills hit. The more I've watched, I have hesitancy about buying those skill sets where how much is his ability to get to the rim based on speed compared to lower competition, and how much, because like you have to have so much faith in that he can put pressure on the rim if you don't believe in the shot. And so I don't know if I believe that much in it. So my preference is right now between Williams and Holland, and Buzelis is growing on me. I was lower on him to start this year when he was talked about as a number 1. And the more I watch him, the more I can talk myself in. But the initial gut reaction to Buzelis was a little bit of hesitation for me.
Yeah, I think with Buzelis, I'm skeptical of his actual coming together, bringing it all together. But he's big. He's had jump shots in the past, at least in high school. It hasn't translated up to the G League. And honestly, the indicators are rough, but he's talented, man. I think the Ignite really screwed over a lot of people in just that positioning for them all, where they didn't have a point guard. So guys like Buzelis, who is primarily a shooter, isn't going to get those looks. I think that's extremely worrying.
Yeah, last question here about Buzelis and Holland. Buzelis shot 26% from 3, but is regarded as the more skilled offensive player. Holland was in that same whereabouts from 3, and he's talked about as having deficiencies as a shooter. Does that inspire more faith about Buzelis, who's got he can shoot it, but he's not shooting it, or Holland because that's a deficiency, yet he was more productive? To me, I have more faith in Holland.
Yeah, I think I lean that way too. I've been burned too many times by guys who the shot is beautiful and it doesn't go in. Because sometimes the aesthetics doesn't matter. Like, I mean, Tyrese Halliburton, prime example. That shot is not pretty. He's extremely efficient. So I think I trust the numbers on that. Yeah, I think Holland's shot is actually better than really is given credit for, because his mistake, I feel like his shot is very workable in that regard, where it's like, okay, he has the free throw percentage, he has the touch. It's really just getting everything consistent. So I like Holland a lot.
All right, we're on the same side there. We're gonna talk to you guys about something really interesting that I mentioned last episode. We're gonna discuss the players who can really help teams grow by playing well in contracts, and a lot of good teams, I'd say almost all good teams, have hit on their late round picks, and that's really helped accelerate their chances. So, who can the Jazz help accelerate their chances to contend by picking late in the 2024 NBA draft? But first, let me tell you about BetterHelp. This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Sometimes we all need the opportunity to get something off of our chest. Big or small, certain things can really start to get to you. It's important to let that out, especially to someone who's unbiased on your life. For example, I can tell you how I really and truly feel about who the Jazz should draft, but sometimes it's not all that simple, and it's not on one's mind to the point where you can just say it to anyone. You have to say it to someone who's able to help you. Therapy can be different for everyone. Most of us have bigger problems than our favorite sports team, and it's important to get that off your chest every once in a while. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule, and we're all busy, don't I know it? So if you can carve out a moment to help your health, you really should. But visit betterhelp.com/lockedonnba to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedonnba. And I also need to tell you about Monopoly Go. We've all been there, either as a player or as a fan. It's halftime. The scoreboard is not looking good. You're feeling it, man. You're feeling low. You're not sure your team can pull out the win. That's when you dig deep, lift your head, and say to yourself, "It's time to get back in the game. Pull off some bank heists and take as much of my friend's money as I possibly can." That's right. Go download the Smash mobile hit Monopoly Go. Lets you compete with your friends and get the most riches and the biggest empire. It's the Monopoly you love and loved in your childhood, but on your phone anytime, with tons of new twists, including leaderboards to compare your progress to your buddies. And there's so much to do. Play on countless dynamic Monopoly boards. Make your friends bankrupt by smashing their landmarks with a wrecking ball. Charge other players for rent for your iconic properties. You can even work with your friends to crack open community chests and tournaments and get extra awards and climb up the leaderboard. So get back out there, put on your game face, and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play. Well, welcome back into Locked On Jazz. Richard Stayman was kind enough to join and educate us about the NBA draft and the prospects within. The NBA can be simple now. It's as simple as having complementary players to stars that are affordable, because the CBA's changed the game. You need to be able to complement your stars with enough good players to have depth and not overpay to compromise your future. So how can the Jazz do so? I can start with, if there's no stars in this draft, you can get those guys that have depth. A lot of good drafts, or a lot of drafts that are said are bad, are typically ones with good depth later. They just lack star power. This is what I foresee this draft to be. So, Richard, I'll turn it over to you. Who are players that you would look at for the Jazz to pick at 29 and 32? And you can tell me players that you have ranked higher that are just kind of floating around there for mocks, and just educate some Jazz fans.
Yeah, so just a little bit about that range. I would say once you hit 20, 21, actually, God, even going into 15, the second the lottery ends, it's really anything goes right now. We really don't have a good picture. Like a lot of years, it starts taking shape by now, at least, of, these guys are going to go here. This guy's not going above a certain point, below a certain point. There's been zero indication of that right now. So we're playing catch up on that, because it's just the state of the draft. Someone's number 20 player might be another person's number 8. So we just really don't know. I think there are guys, though, that are definitively in that 20 plus range. And from there, it's obviously anything can happen. I'll start with two different guys that I do think could fit the Jazz very well. One of them is one of your absolute favorite players in the draft, and that's Jalen Tyson from California. Pretty all-around wing. Really, with him, just quick background. He's an all-around wing, super athletic. I've been around him. He's from Dallas. I've seen him work out in a bunch, practice and stuff, train over here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Extremely hard worker. He perfects every single drill. He was the hardest worker at a camp I saw. Very athletic. And he transferred he's been at 3 schools in 3 years, but I think, a lot of times that's a red flag, but he's not the case with that. His first year, he committed to Texas Tech out of high school. Chris Beard went to Texas. He told him to follow him. He said, hey, I'll get you in the rotation. 0 plans to ever do so. Barely ever played. Jalen was frustrated, transferred back to Tech where he wanted to be. Had a, I think, very good year in limited size minutes. And then Mark Adams had a massive racist controversy, and he was fired. So that's another coach that he had to get burned through. And obviously with Chris Beard too, like he left right after he was there as well to Mississippi. And then on top of that, now he's at Cal, and he did great. He's going pro. So don't look at him like the other 3 schools guys. It's very contextual with him. I think he's somebody who should easily be a first-round pick.
Yeah, and that's someone on Locked On NBA Big Board I've talked about as someone I would consider for the Jazz, and I actually had him as high as 20 on my initial renditions of a board. He's a first-team All-Conference in the Pac-12. I don't know if anyone meant more to their team in the Pac-12 than he did. The guy I had him in that top 20 with that I would say is unpopular in this range, according to most boards, but I'm pretty steadfast that this is a guy I would take for the Jazz at 29 or 32 is Baylor Shireman from Creighton. He was a 3rd-team All-American, 1st-team All-Big East. He's a productive scorer, rebounder, very good shooter, left-hander who played point guard his first 3 years of college, then transferred up and then found a way to play small forward, power forward. He averaged 18 points, 9 rebounds, and 4 assists. And those are per. Those are actually per 36, but because Shireman played more than 36 minutes, I was going to say that sounded too low. He averaged 19 points, 9 rebounds, and 4 assists, and he shot 38% from 3. He's someone I'd really consider because he played a big role, but he can also play a smaller role and excel moving up levels. So if you move up another level to the NBA, I think he's one of the best 3 shooters in this draft class. As a catch and shoot, he has size and he's a rugged, tenacious rebounder. And those are positional needs. You need to be able to rebound. You need to be able to compete defensively and shoot if you're going to play the 3 or the 4 at the NBA level. So he's another guy. And I have a few players for you that I think I want to get your read on. How about Johnny Furphy and Justin Edwards? They're completely different players who had very, very different paths to relevancy. Edwards was one of the top recruits in the country. I was tremendously low on him coming in. Furphy was a relative unknown. Both had moments and glimpses of playing, hey, that guy could be pretty good at the next level. Those are a couple guys with just a room for growth that I would consider. Are those also among your candidates for the Jazz in these areas?
Yeah, not really. I like Furphy. I don't think he's a fit for the Jazz. He's extremely worrisome on the defensive end. He's had a couple weird turnovers. I think that's kind of a weird, mixed bag. I don't think he's necessarily bad in that regard, but he's not perfect. And when you're struggling defensively and you're a great shooter, you kind of got to be great everywhere else and minimize the turnovers and mistakes. So I'm kind of worried about Furphy there. I don't think he moves the needle a ton. Maybe if you do keep 29 and 32, it's fine. Justin Edwards, I still just don't have a first-round grade on. I don't think he can dribble really. Because of that, he can't attack closeouts. I don't think he's a great shooter. Very athletic, so he's going to cut and defend well. But I don't think it's enough to take that high of a pick.
I'm with you there. Edwards is the one I have lower. I actually really like Furphy. I saw Furphy play in person twice this year at March Madness. He shoots the ball with a high release. He's active. And I think the biggest issue for him defensively is just strength. I think he's a bit of a string bean and not as developed. He's also younger than some of the others. And then that leads me, and the reason I asked it in that order, because they were kind of foils, as one was a heralded freshman, one was unheralded. Now you got one that was a completely unheralded player that I came into this year saying, oh, I've got a guy I think is going to sneak his way into the lottery. And the more I watched him, I was like, dang it, I'm wrong. But the more I saw him, people started to promote him, but I was like, oh man, I don't think he's doing that well. That's Ryan Dunn from Virginia. I did a podcast with Rafael Barley of Locked On NBA Big Board in about May of last year, said, who are the best sophomores coming in? And instead of Kyle Filipowski and Tyrese Proctor, I mentioned Ryan Dunn from Virginia as someone I thought could break out to make it into even the lottery. In some boards, he was there. I think, the best defensive player in this class, him and Alex Sarr. That's a true discussion, and one of them's going number one per most boards. Dunn really struggles offensively, but you're seeing Jaden McDaniels go out there for the Timberwolves and change everything. Defend Durant, defend Booker, into Booker having one of his worst shooting games of his career. You're seeing that, and he's a non-factor offensively, except for on slashes and runouts. Can Ryan Dunn just find his way off of sheer defense in the NBA because it's becoming valuable to have lockdown defenders against the premier wings in the league? The more I watch of the NBA playoffs, the more I think, okay, Ryan Dunn's going to be a top 20 pick.
I am not a big fan of Ryan Dunn. I think we've seen similar defenders come in and really struggle to carve out a role in the NBA, like Matisse Thybulle. Matisse Thybulle still can't crack 20 minutes most of his career. Ryan Dunn is way worse offensively. He is a center on offense and a perimeter defender. Really, he can guard most positions. He can play a little bit of help side defense at the rim, but he's mostly 1 through 4 on defense. And I just don't think he moves the needle enough on the offensive end to like if you need him for a few minutes a game. Yeah, I feel like it's not that valuable. Maybe at 32, it's fine. You can see if you have something there. Maybe the jump shot comes along, like you said, but I don't know. I'm not a big fan of him.
I watched more Virginia games than I really wanted to. It was pretty brutal. And the more I watched this, I said, okay, maybe I'm wrong. I got to move him out of the first round. And then I started watching the playoffs the other day, and I thought to myself, I think there's a place for Ryan Dunn. I think someone's going to take a swing and say, you know what, if we can even get him to 25% from three, like not good at all, he's going to play, because I think he's that special, the defensive prospect. And then I've got 3 more names. I just want a brief thought on these, and if you would take them if you're the Jazz. I have Tyler Kolek from Marquette. I have Keyshawn George from Miami, and I've got we already talked about Jalen Tyson. That was my last guy, but you took that thunder early. So you know, I know you like Kolek, and I know you're a Miami fan, so I assume you like George. Take me through where you have them on your board and if you would consider them for the Utah Jazz.
Yeah, so first of all, love Tyler Kolek. I think he's a true floor general. A lot of people compare him to Brunson. I personally don't see it. I really do like Kolek, but I don't see it because he's a lefty floor general. And yeah, like some of the stats are similar, but he doesn't have, I don't think he has that in-between game that Jalen Brunson had, or necessarily the perimeter shot creation. So that's a limitation. But I do think his overall point guard ability and able to just easily find everybody else good shots and himself simple shots, I think it's really effective. And he's not a good defender, but he will be competitive on that end. And like, he doesn't like getting blown by. He's not happy. He doesn't settle. Right. And I think that matters. Keyshawn George would be extremely confusing for a lot of people. I think that'd be second place to the 2 Jalen Williamses in Oklahoma City. And also, just side note, if you didn't know, there's another Jalen Williams in this draft, so be careful of that. But I think he's a good shooter. Some of it I feel like is very much a results over process thinking with him. I like him. I think he's smart. I liked him a lot in the preseason, but I think the jump shot's a little bit overstated. He didn't get to the line like at all. That's kind of a worry for me when you're 6'7". I'd say, actually, I was going to say a third name. The other one I meant to, instead of going on the rant about Jalen Tyson earlier and taking this thunder, was Kevin McCullough, who's grown a lot on the offensive end and has been deemed one of the top defenders in the entire country. So I think those are 3 guys, for the most part. All of those would be good. In order, I would put, honestly, I may put McCullough 1, George 2, Kolek 3, just because I feel like Kolek doesn't, I don't know, you could use a point guard, maybe Kolek 2 and George 3.
Well, yeah, it's interesting to see the similar thought process but different results, because I would definitely be lower on McCullough, and I like Dunn a lot more because I think he's a better defender, and I think McCullough's not great offensively either. But that's the beauty of the draft. It's if you can find one of these players that are hard to find in a draft, you can really elevate your chances. So thank you guys for listening to Locked On Jazz. And Locked On has a lot to option. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and it's now available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top stories of the day with local experts on Locked On Plus, our national shows covering every league, everywhere you want to find it. Find Locked On Sports Today, now available on the free Fire TV channels app. So thank you guys for listening. Make sure to tune into the experts on Locked On channels all over the place. like Richard, if you enjoyed the content, make sure to find him on MavsDraft on Twitter. He interacts with everyone, and that's how we became friends, interacting about Jazz draft picks. He's an awesome guy on there, so appreciate your time. And until next time, thank you guys for listening to Locked On Jazz.